If you have your Bibles, I would invite you to open to John chapter 7. That's where we're going to be this morning as we begin our time together. When I was in college, I had the opportunity to study abroad in Israel my junior year, and that was not planned from the beginning, but a number of events transpired that allowed me to go, and so I got to spend an entire academic year in Israel. It was life-changing. It gave me so many perspectives that I didn't have before. I really believe that God used that year to develop and to grow and to challenge me in just how I read His Word, how I understand who He is, and how He has worked through the history of humanity. And so it was life-changing. But there were also a lot of really fun things that happened. And one of them happened as I first got there. So we ended up going to, there was a group of about 5 students that were studying. It was a very small program. And we ended up going to Ohio and doing kind of some preliminary coursework in preparation for going to Israel. And so we were there through August, and then middle of September, we ended up flying in, and we started our school year. And just a number of weeks into our program, this event happened in Israel that I had no idea about. But it's called Shavuot. No, that's not right. It's called Sukkot in Israel. And so there's 3 main feasts, holidays, biblical holidays that the Jewish people have been commanded to observe, and Sukkot is one of them. In our passage today, in John chapter 7, this is the feast that is going on, and that Jesus and his disciples would have been expected to go to Jerusalem to observe. It's interesting to note in the book of John that these feasts of the Jewish people are kind of time markers for how we work our way through. And so you can actually set the chronology of how we understand Jesus' 3.5 years, in particular from John, as he kind of uses Passover, Pesach, as a time marker, and then some of the other feasts. And so that's what we're going to see today. And I want to give a little bit of context to the Feast of Sukkot, because it's actually going to be the stage setter for how we are going to spend our time for the next coming weeks. And so it's a significant event. The reason that I wanted to tell you about my time in Israel is because I didn't know anything about it until people on our kibbutz started going and gathering date palm leaves, which are these massive branches, and they were just hoarding them. And we're like, what is going on? Why are people gathering all these branches? Why are they cutting branches off? One of the things that Sukkot is observed by is this fun tradition of making little forts outside of everybody's home. And so this is actually in the Bible, prescribed in a couple of different places. Deuteronomy 29 is one of the ones where we see some of these commands that come in the law. But the Jewish people have been commanded to remember this feast as a way of remembering what God has done. And so there's a number of significances to it. But I remember as a junior in college thinking, what is going on? Where am I? This was culture shock to me. But we ended up getting to get invited to help with preparing one of the little forts that they made, one of these little booths that some of the kids would sleep in. There were also... It was kind of coming off of summer season, so there were still snakes and scorpions out. I was not interested in sleeping in the booth. But it was a fun tradition, and so we had a little booth set up right outside our house for the week of Sukkot. And that's what you would see often throughout the land, even today. I want to just read to you some of what Sukkot was supposed to represent. It's the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, maybe also called the Ingathering. This is a feast that took place annually on the Israeli month of Tishrei, on the 15th day of the 7th month. It's actually exactly 6 months from the time that Passover happens to the Feast of Booths. And it would be 5 days after the Day of Atonement. This takes place now in early to mid-October as we track the calendar. And this festival is described in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy and in Numbers. Here is what the festival, this feast, was supposed to accomplish. 7 days, the Israelites were presenting offerings to the Lord, during which time they lived in these huts made from palm fronds and leafy tree branches. The stated purpose for the living in the booths was to recall the sojourn of the Israelites prior to the taking of the land in Canaan. If you remember, we read that the Israelites, because they didn't enter the promised land on God's timetable, they were called to wander in the wilderness 40 years, 1 year for each day that the spies were in the land. And clearly, as God moved the nation from one place to another, this was their living arrangement. They dwelt in tents, and this is how God provided for them. This week was to be a time of joy as the final celebration and thanksgiving for that year's harvest would take place. So this feast not only is to recall to mind the way that God provided for the nation through the wilderness years, but also a feast to celebrate God's good provision to the nation. And they would often this would coincide with the harvest that would take place in the fall. This series of offerings that would take place over this 8-day period were an extraordinary expense. A burnt offering was entirely consumed by fire so that even the priests could not eat it. That expense, coupled with the requirement that the Israelites would abandon the comfort of their homes for a week to live in flimsy huts, often in the city of Jerusalem, implies that a principal lesson behind this week was that all the good things of the promised land are gifts from God. They cannot be hoarded or taken for granted, and at the same time, returning to a period of living as aliens in huts helped to recall the sense of national community experienced in the period of the Exodus. This is a significant feast, still to this day, but clearly in the time of Jesus. Josephus, as he wrote, mentions this feast, and he says, it's a long quote, but I'll just share what he says at the end. He says, "This feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, happened to fall at the same time every year and was kept by the Hebrews as a most holy and most eminent feast." In the first century, this was premier. You would make sure that you were at this feast. In John, even in the time that we've covered, in chapter 1, we see in chapter 2, we see the first Passover where Jesus goes and cleanses the temple. And then in chapters 3 and 4, he's doing ministry in Judea and Samaria. Then he comes back in chapter 5, and we're told of an unnamed feast. There's speculation on which feast that could be. It could be the Feast of Booths. It could be this one that we're celebrating just a year prior. Scholars are torn on which that was. In chapter 6, where we were the last few weeks, we see Passover, the second Passover that's stated in John's Gospel. And here in chapter 7, we're told that we get to this feast. And so I've titled this message this morning, Festivities at the Feast, because we're going to see in quite a long passage, and we'll read it all in its entirety and just make a few comments and let the text really speak for itself. Jesus and his mission and his authority as a mouthpiece for the Father is going to continue to get progressively more tense as he goes back down to this feast. I just will include, just briefly, this is I thought a succinct version of what some scholars say about this feast. But we've already covered it, so you know what? Ask me later and I'll show it to you. This morning, as we read in our passage, I want to look at 4 surprising elements of Jesus' festivities at the feast. And so with that in mind, would you just join me once again in prayer as we commit this time to the Lord? God, we are so grateful that your word has power and authority and significance for us today. I pray that this morning as we open it and as we glean from it, that you would impress upon us the things that you have for us to learn and to apply. We thank you that in these sections where it's so narrative and storytelling driven, that even in the midst of reading about what your life and ministry was like, it has such significance for us. And so I pray that you would help to shape us to be better worshipers of you as a result of our time in your word. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. I want to look at 4 surprising elements that we're going to see in the feast. There are clearly more that we could focus on, but for the sake of time, I'll just highlight 4. We'll see this as Jesus is coming off of chapter 6. He has just had this incredible tense conversation where he's challenging his followers to eat his flesh and to drink his blood, and the significance of the spiritual call instead of the physical realities. And we've talked about that for the last many weeks. And here in chapter 7, we see a hinge point. And so in verse 1, we read this. It says this, after this whole conversation in chapter 6, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. We've been told this before. I have just a quick map to show you. I don't know if you can see that. So Galilee is up in this area. Judea, where Jesus is not going, is down in the south of the country. Clearly closer to Jerusalem, where the religious elite, the authorities of that day, would probably have been. And so for whatever significant tensions there were between Jesus and the religious elite, for this time around this feast, specifically between Passover of chapter 6, verse 4, and the 6 months that led up to this feast, it seems that Jesus chose to stay in Galilee and to not go down south again. And so we read that, and we're reminded of the danger of the circumstances that were challenging Jesus' ministry. In John chapter 5, verse 18, after Jesus does this healing in Jerusalem, he's challenged, and he heals this man, this lame man in Jerusalem, and Jesus does this on the Sabbath. And this issue that happened so many chapters ago is still going to be this hot point of contention for the religious elite. But in John chapter 5, we're told that this healing on the Sabbath is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. Because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was calling himself he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. And so those are the two issues, is that Jesus healed on the Sabbath, and then he claimed he claimed authority on behalf of God the Father. And so in chapter 7, we still see the ramifications of this event. Jesus stayed in Galilee. He wouldn't go to Judea because they were still seeking to kill him. So we continue on in verse 2. Now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand. So his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works that you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For not even his brothers believed in him. So Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it, that its works are evil. You go up to the feast. I am not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come." And after saying this, he remained in Galilee. But after his brothers had gone, he also went up, not publicly, but privately. The first significance that we see, this interesting claim that the text gives us, is that Jesus' travel was out of the norm. This is a surprising element of Jesus getting to the feast. We know this from the recordings of for instance, Luke, when we're told of Jesus as a boy traveling to Jerusalem, and then he gets left and his parents have to go back. Do you remember this story? This would be because the travel plans were that the people in those cities would travel together in large numbers. And so that's probably what is at mind here. But we see that his brothers have some kind of agenda at mind. That word for brothers, it might just mean any kind of relative, family relative. But I think in the context, it's clear, as John, the apostle, John, the one who worked with Jesus, as he records this, it's clear that the brothers whom, at least for a time, did not believe, were challenging him to go to this feast. It doesn't seem like their motive was pure. It doesn't seem like Jesus' family, his brothers, maybe his sisters would be included in this word. It doesn't seem like the motive for them to challenge him to go down to the feast and to continue doing the things that he was doing in Galilee. had Jesus' interest in mind. Because John tells us that his brothers didn't believe in him. In verse 5, that's the only place that I know of in the Gospels where we read of that. Now, John, who is the last apostle to write, I think includes that, because who are Jesus' brothers in the first century after Jesus' resurrection and ascension? Well, James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem. We know Jude, who wrote and was also called Jesus' brother. It seems like at some point, probably after the resurrection, things changed. But early in Jesus' ministry, Jesus' brothers did not believe that he was Messiah. And to the point that they were inviting him to go to the feast and to either get out of town. We don't really know what the motive was. Maybe to get out of town so that he would stop being, the focal point of their entire life. It's interesting to try and speculate why they would ask him that. But Jesus' response is one that we've seen in the Gospel of John as well as other places. Jesus says, "My time has not come." This idea of his hour, his time, is certainly in reference to the full revealing of his messiahship when he would go and satisfy the Father's will by going to the city and dying on the cross and dying a real death and rising an authentic resurrection. It's clear that those are the things that are in mind. But it's funny because as we read about Jesus' brothers challenging him to go with the people, and he's saying, "I'm not going, my time has not come, you can go," and they leave, we read in verse 10 that somehow Jesus changes his mind. And in verse 10, we see that after his brothers had gone up, he also went up, not publicly, but in private. This probably is in reference to just not going with the city, not being in the caravan that would have traveled. But there's speculation on that. What comes to my mind, any of you sports fans, I love baseball, not because baseball is interesting. Baseball's kind of boring to watch. But playing it kind of gives you a different perspective. But I love baseball season in particular because of the team brawls that happen. Have you ever done that dangerous dance of going on YouTube and watching two teams that clear benches and they meet in the field and they're saying really mean things, but usually they don't try to touch each other, and then sometimes somebody will say something really mean and they get ejected, and the team manager comes and he gets ejected. I don't know why that's so fascinating to me, but I've spent more time than I'd care to admit watching those replays. But what comes to mind, the reason I bring that up is because it's so comedic to me when a baseball manager will get thrown out, and sometimes maybe not for good reason. Maybe the umpire who evicts the manager hears somebody else say something and just assumes it was the manager and throws him out. And I love watching those videos. I've seen it a couple times where, like, the manager will get thrown out, they go to the locker room, and then all of a sudden the camera will kind of focus back in the dugout way deep in the back, and the manager's wearing the glasses and the fake mustache thing. Have you ever seen any of those? I think Ichiro did it one time, who played for the Mariners. I tell you that because I think that this is a little bit like this privacy that Jesus is going to this feast. If there was anyone who deserved to be at the Feast of Booths, to be at the front lines, and to be celebrating the entirety of the event, I think it would have been Jesus. And yet, because of the reality of the Jewish elite who are seeking to kill him, there's this vague description that Jesus didn't go publicly with everyone, but he ended there in private. If anyone was supposed to be at the feast, it was Jesus. And here he is in the back, kind of hiding, waiting for his time. And this is a surprising element of this feast that was to be remembered. The second element that we see comes to us in verses 11 through 14. So the Jews, verse 11, were looking for him at the feast. Jesus, it would make sense that he was there for this. And the Jewish people, maybe the religious elite, but certainly those who knew of Jesus were looking for him. And they said, "Where is he?" And there was much muttering about him among the people. While some said, "He is a good man," others said, "No, he is leading the people astray." Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. There's this interesting detail that John records of the mixed response to Jesus and of anyone who should have been there from the beginning of the feast. Jesus, verse 10 tells us, went privately, probably with his disciples, maybe a little bit after the fact, but he was certainly the talk of the feast. Verse 14, so about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? The second surprising element that we see at the feast is Jesus' teaching schedule. Clearly, Jesus was expected to be there, and I would guess that there were probably plans and agendas by the religious to entrap him or to arrest him or even to kill him. That seems to be what their main motivation was. And yet, despite all of this, Jesus arrives privately and halfway through the feast, in the middle of the feast, whatever that timing would have been, Jesus goes up into the temple and he begins to publicly teach. It's clear that these mixed opinions on Jesus, who expected to see him before he actually shows up, would indicate that Jesus should have been there. And so I'm sure it was a surprise to both the watching world and to the religious leadership of the day when Jesus does show up on his own teaching schedule. But when Jesus got there, he took the crowds by silence. They were astounded. They marveled at his learning. How can this man who has never studied under the rabbinical schools, how can this man who has no formal training teach like this? Isn't it interesting that the questions they're asking have still already been answered through Jesus' claims of authority and divinity? He has come to do the Father's will, and he's doing it in ways that nobody expected. He doesn't arrive at the right time. He doesn't start teaching at the right time. And yet, the people marvel at his learning. Which leads us to the third surprising element found in chapter 7, verse 16. So Jesus answered them, "My teaching is not mine, but it is his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood." The third thing that we see is the content that Jesus teaches with. These claims are still the same claims as before. My Father has sent me with the message. You want to know how I've learned? Because God the Father has sent me with a message. Here we see another surprise as Jesus doubles down on where his authority comes from. The source of his authority is God himself. This echoes the same content from what we've seen in chapters 5 and 6. But the unity and the mission of God the Father, who has sent Jesus to proclaim his message, is clear and astounding. This idea of the crowds who marveled, it's that Greek word, and I don't have that paper that I wrote it down on, but it was an interesting word to look up. This idea of marveling depends on context as to whether it's a positive or a negative connotation. And I would say, I think there's probably a little bit of both going on here. As the crowds hear Jesus, and we're not even told what he really is speaking. What passage did he use? What content, what analogies, what parables did Jesus use? We're not told. What we are told is that Jesus' teaching is authoritative and convincing and academically robust. And Jesus teaches that the words and the authority that he has do not come from anyone besides God the Father. Verse 18, the one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory. Seems like Jesus is saying, that's not my story. The one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Jesus doubles down on the source of his authority that seemed to incite, once again, the religious elite to anger and to a motivation of arrests and eventual death. And so we see, as the chapter finishes up in verse 19, it says this, "Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law." Can I just pause quickly? If anything that Jesus has said has been controversial up to this point, this blows it out of the water. Can I read what Jesus says again? Has not Moses given you the law, yet none of you keeps the law? Jesus now turns and accuses the religious elite on a solemn and holy event, the Feast of Booths, that the law is not being kept by those who are claiming that Jesus is not keeping the law. Do you see the irony? And Jesus has now moved from unlikable to unacceptable. This claim has serious accusation. Verse 20, "The crowd answered, 'You have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you?'" Maybe there are some who don't know the motive of the religious elite, but it seems that Jesus' target of this public teaching and accusation of not following the law extends beyond just the religious Pharisaical class to maybe all who are there. And so the accusation is returned to Jesus in its most severe form. You have a demon. What you're saying does not come from God. It comes from Satan, from the powers of evil and darkness. And verse 21, Jesus answered them, "I did one work, and you all marvel at it." There's that word marvel again, to stop them in their shoes. "Moses gave you circumcision," not that it's from Moses, but it's from the fathers, "and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well?" Verse 24, "Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." The fourth and final surprising element of Jesus' festivities at the Feast of Booths is his Sabbath confrontation. The very accusation that has come against Jesus all the way back in chapter 5, that he healed on the Sabbath and therefore was a lawbreaker, is now the same accusation that Jesus gives to the entire crowd. It's a little bit confusing, so let me try to help you understand what Jesus is saying here. In the law, rabbis studied and argued over centuries, years and years and years, what is the right application of these 613 laws that are found in the Torah. And so what they found as they studied and they argued and they expounded on the law after law after law is that there were some things that didn't match. So, for example, what Jesus uses here, the sign of circumcision, which he equates not to Moses but to Abraham. This was God's covenant sign to his people. He chose Abraham, and he said, "This will be your physical sign. You're going to circumcise, and you'll do that on the 8th day. When the baby is born, 8 days later, you will perform circumcision." Now, here's the problem. These other laws that Jesus is accused of breaking, one of them was don't work on the Sabbath. And so for those whose role it was to perform circumcision on the 8th day, that was a working idea, an ideal, right? They would, to do that, to perform that would be work. So what happens when a baby is born and 8 days later the Sabbath falls on the day they're supposed to be circumcised? Which law becomes more important? Which rule do we follow? And the rabbis had decided, it seems, that in this case, you would do work to perform the circumcision as a way to keep the law. And Jesus says, here's the irony. What you accuse me of doing, you have broken yourself by not keeping the law. Now, the rabbinical argument for this is that it is a way to keep the body well and as well as obedience. But the reality is, some of the rabbinical back and forth was, well, you can do something to save someone's life on the Sabbath, and that wouldn't be breaking the law. But something that can wait, you can wait until the next day. I don't know that circumcision would have fallen into life-saving measure, but because it was required by God, they chose to adhere to this law, and for those circumstances in which circumcision fell on a Sabbath day, they would break that law. That's what Jesus is saying. I hope that kind of makes sense, and there's probably more that could be said to make that clearer. But Jesus, as the accusation that he gives, you don't follow the law, and their rebuttal is, you have a demon, and his rebuttal is, actually, you've accused me of this one issue. I healed a man. I made a man walk on the Sabbath day months ago, and this has been the crux that has stalled everything that the religious leaders think of Jesus. That was the backbreaker. And Jesus says, what's interesting is that in right motive, you've decided you can work on the Sabbath to keep some of the law. But this goes back to where we were in chapter 5. And Pastor Dan did a really good job of helping us understand. God is the Sabbath maker. He is the law giver. And to have Jesus perform this miracle, which was so offensive in that day, Jesus claims that God has always been working. From the beginning of creation, God the Father has been working, and God has sent Jesus to continue this work. This is, we've said this from our all the way back in chapter 5. This is going to be one of the leading issues that will prevent people from following Jesus. And while Jesus' authority continues to be claimed, I don't think it helps his cause that he doubles down so hard here on such a holy feast. But yet that was Jesus doing the will of him who sent him. The glory was not for Jesus, it was for God the Father. Verse 18. I struggled as I was studying through this text to think about the so what. This is an interesting text. It has a lot of detail. So what? How does this affect us? I just put a question up that really I continue to wrestle with, and maybe you could think through on your own. How should we respond to Jesus' authoritative claims and righteous judgments? It's easy for us to read the detail. And in particular, I highlighted verse 18 and verse 24. It's easy for us to read the detail of what Jesus challenges his oppressors of that day to. But the same Jesus who claimed authority and righteous judgment then is the Jesus that you and I worship, who is just as authoritative and just as righteous in his judgments. So the question that I ask myself, and maybe that I ask you by extension, what's my response to Jesus' authority? Do I respond rightly? Do I get hung up on the things that I think I know better than him? Do I allow the distractions and the things that I have come to settle on in my own heart, do I allow those things to be shaped by who he is and how he has communicated himself and how he continues to work? Or do I allow what I think I know to dictate my response? I think that's a hard question to answer when we start to put that into all of the facets of our lives. Jesus is just as authoritative on this side of the cross as he was at the Feast of Booths. And Jesus has calling and questioning for you and for I as we go through our lives. And we would do well to learn from this passage. What would it look like for us to not chase after our own glory of what we think we know, but to be shaped and informed by the authority of God himself? I think it's an appropriate thing for us to think on as we look to the communion table. And so I'm going to invite the worship team to come up. We're just going to sing a couple more songs as we prepare our hearts for communion.